Friends, welcome to yet another video in our series Finance and Investing Tidbits. We all are familiar with this idea of outsourcing. However, quite often people look at outsourcing as a one-way street. In other words, you always outsource. But there is a need to check break-even point of outsourcing arrangement too, and maybe a stage comes when it may be worthwhile insourcing. Let's explore that idea in this video. Now, outsourcing has many dimensions. Broadly, there are three. What I mean by dimensions is there are three important ways in which outsourcing is done. This video, of course, is focused on one of them, which is very important. But let's explore those three ways in which outsourcing is done. So one kind of outsourcing, which is very common, is what is called as plain and simple labor arbitrage. Labor arbitrage simply means work is assigned externally to take advantage of low labor costs. So if the same set of employees were to be directly employed by the parent company, it would cost much more than if those tasks were outsourced to a contractor. The contractor in turn would employ people, but obviously their pay level would be much lower than if they were to be employed by the parent company. So the contractor charges some additional cost for employing those people, but even then the outsource cost is much lower than the cost of directly recruiting those people. Plus, of course, that being a non-core activity, and it also reduces the headcount, where companies are very conscious of their headcount. It works quite well from that strategy perspective as well. So this is very common in respect of certain aspects like security aspects, housekeeping, canteen, and some of those activities, drivers, instead of employing drivers, you actually outsource to a contractor, or even hire cabs rather than owning those cars in the name of the company. So all that is plain and simple labor arbitrage kind of outsourcing, which is very widely prevalent. The other dimension of outsourcing is that work is assigned to teams in a low cost geography. The earlier case was where in the same geography you outsource it to a low cost contractor. Another case which actually happens in case of multinationals, and this has very widely happened in global banks, where a lot of back offices have been set up in India. Now this is where again a low cost arbitrage is achieved. However, this happens across geographies. So a US or European bank may employ 20-25% of their staff or employees in India, taking advantage of talented people available at a much lower cost. So the expensive locations actually trim the headcount there, and then you actually pass it on to developing countries which offer lower cost. In both these examples of outsourcing, the nature of cost does not change fundamentally, though the level of cost comes down. So, for example, if you were to employ people directly on your payroll or in a parent location which is very expensive, and instead you were to either outsource to a contractor or to another geography like India, where you can source very good talent at very reasonable global cost. In these situations, the nature of cost does not change, because by and large, whatever are fixed costs, costs which are paid for by time, like the employee salaries, the nature of that cost continues, though the level of cost comes down. So there is a certain advantage, but it does not fundamentally alter the cost structure. But a third and a very important dimension of outsourcing is where the nature of cost itself undergoes a fundamental change. So if the company were to create that certain capacity itself, it would result into significant fixed costs. So fixed costs are those which are linked to capacity creation, and fixed costs are those which are typically paid for by time. So instead of creating that capacity oneself, and when I say capacity, it does not necessarily mean plant and machinery, it can even mean human capacity. So instead of investing directly in that capacity oneself and creating a continuous stream of fixed costs, organizations actually convert fixed costs into variable costs. And that's why I'm saying that the nature of cost itself undergoes a fundamental change. For example, a company was producing a component for its finished products earlier. So naturally, it had its own equipment, it had certain manpower, it occupied certain factory space, and there were a lot of fixed costs associated with it. Now, it actually outsources the manufacture to someone else. What it does in the process is that it converts the fixed costs into a variable cost. Since the manufacturer would now be paid a per unit processing charge, or even the responsibility of procuring the raw materials could be given to the contractor, and you pay the contractor a consolidated amount not only for the raw materials but also the conversion cost or processing charge. So again, in this outsourcing, two models are possible where you procure raw materials and then pass on those materials to a third party for conversion, where that party charges you a processing charge or a conversion fee from a raw material to a finished product. Or the other model here is that you actually convert that into a procurement, whereby the responsibility of procuring the raw materials is also given to the vendor, and the further processing value addition is also done by the vendor. So both those models are perfectly possible. So this involves a fundamental change in cost structure. Um, However, one thing which is often not done is to calculate the break-even point of this outsourcing arrangement. Now, when we do this outsourcing, we always look at the current demand scenario, and we plot, well, how much does it cost right now, and if we were to outsource it, how much would it cost right now, and we take that decision. However, the detailed analysis of variable and fixed costs would tell us that there is a certain level of activity up to which outsourcing would work out cheaper. So typically when the volume requirement is lower, outsourcing always works favorably. But if the demand for that quantity keeps on rising, a stage may come where the paradigm may undergo a bit of a change. So after that volume is crossed, it may not make a lot of sense to outsource it. So the cost of producing in-house can actually become lower than if you were to outsource that to somebody else. Of course, there are certain benefits of outsourcing to a specialist, because that specialist can bring advantage of scale to us, because that specialist may not be manufacturing only for us, but maybe for others as well. And to that extent, there has to be a mechanism to handle this conflict of interest. And if it's not a very tricky technology that has to be guarded very confidentially, you may not mind outsourcing to a specialist. But nonetheless, it's very important to check the break-even point and take certain steps. So even if strategically the work is not to be brought in, when the volume goes up, the cost can be negotiated with the vendor or service provider. And of course, if the vendor or service provider is not willing to budge, then one can even seriously think of whether it's worthwhile insourcing it, so that you are able to achieve a lower cost. Now, this is a very strategic decision. If the difference is marginal, it's okay, you may not mind it. But if the difference is very significant, it may be worthwhile exploring the insourcing option. Of course, the decision whether this is a core area or a non-core area is also very important in this thought process. So quite often, friends, outsourcing is thought to be a one-way street. That means you take a decision and permanently outsource something, but it is not. It should be revisited from time to time just to check the break-even level, the volume beyond which insourcing may start to look attractive. That must be done so that we are able to take a considered view. I hope you have liked the video. If you have, please share it with others too. Thank you.